Okay, I think we can probably get started.
All
right. So just quickly, now that we're recording and more people are here, meeting times, I guess we should potentially send out a doodle or something with a bunch of meeting times. But the two times that we had discussed previously, which are again being proposed now, would be Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific, US Pacific time, which is after SIG apps, and would and then later on Thursdays, such as after the community meeting, 11 a.m. Pacific time. Tuesdays and Wednesdays have large numbers of SIG meetings already, all overlapping. And Fridays, of course, is Friday evening in Europe. So we don't do community meetings on Fridays generally. And afternoons are out for similar reasons on every other day. So there's not a lot of latitude. There are some SIGs that actually schedule over the community meeting, but I don't want to do that. So, I mean, if 6 a.m. Pacific time, yeah, that'll get more attendance. So I'll probably just, I don't know, if there are only two possible times, I don't know if we really need like a complicated survey or whatever, I may just start an email on the mailing list.
What exactly are the clashes with the current time, Brian?
It overlaps commute times for large numbers of people.
Oh, so it's just too early,
like
basically.
Most of the other SIG leads, and I think even Jobita has said this before, I don't see him on today, is that the 8:30 time specifically like overlaps people who leave both earlier and later.
There was a tremendous amount of churn about this time. It was quite the battle. So,
so it's not the day. It's just 8:30. Any day is difficult.
Correct.
Yeah. So if I understand it right, we have a whole lot of people who attend this or want to attend this who are in the U.S. Pacific time zone. And in the U.S. Pacific time zone, for lots of folks' commutes, it's just a difficult time. At the same time, we want to have the meeting accessible to places in other parts of the world, like Europe, where we have a number of folks. And so trying to find a time that works across so many time zones is just difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, which is why there are so many other SIG meetings packed into Tuesday and Wednesday mornings. But in any case, that was mostly just a heads up. I'll start a thread on the mailing list. And I would like to take it to virtual Couplet. Ria, are you going to present or someone else going to present?
Yeah, I'll talk for a little bit. And then we also have Brendan and we have Bob. So basically we wanted to come, we've been making circles around SIG node, and then I think everyone kind of decided that we should come into here, I'll turn my video so you guys can see who I am. Hello. So yeah, we decided to come here and talk to you guys about virtual Couplet and what we're doing in the space and why we think it's important. The biggest thing, I'm also going to actually link a document so we can just use it as reference for the future. So let me just put that in the chat too. There we go. But our biggest goal, I'll start out with the goal. Our goal is to basically create a nodeless working group, ideally under SIG architecture. And we want to talk about basically what nodeless means in Kubernetes and the fact of just not having any VMs. So for the user, they don't have to manage those VMs. The way that we're doing it is through models like pods as a service. And that's basically the consumption model we're using to enable these sorts of nodeless scenarios. The scenario that we're going towards right now is hybrid. So having both VMs in your cluster and like pods as a service, services within your cluster to be able to spin out to for burst or spillover or things like that. But there's been a lot of customer stories and we've done a lot of customer investigation, and we've also realized that there's been an evolution where about like 10 years ago we were all using on-premise VMs and people had to manage those and things like that and plan for capacity. And then you went into IaaS and you went into the cloud. And with that, you now get like pay as you go, and people are now interacting with VMs in the cloud, but people are still having to manage those VMs. And today with the container space, we're all creating and developing within containers. So why are we making users go down an extra layer and have to manage that extra layer when now we're able to abstract that layer with these containers as a service models? So that's really the biggest, that's a really big overview of what we're looking at. And we wanted to discuss with you guys like what your opinions are, and if it's viable to make that working group, because we really want to be a part of Kubernetes, like proper. We've been spinning out our own, basically our own architecture meetings every week, and we have a bunch of specs. I'll send over this drive too. We have a bunch of things we've been working through, like storage and networking and things like that. So we're trying to harden what all of these things mean in a know this world. And we just, yeah, so that's a broad overview.
I actually had a couple of pieces. I had a couple pieces of color that I wanted to add. One is that I think that sort of container as a service or pod as a service is going to happen one way or the other. I mean,
Brendan, your sound is real bad. Can you speak?
Oh, sorry. Is that bad? Is that better?
Yeah.
I think my headset was not. Sorry, I am commuting actually. I'm one of the people who commutes during this slot. I think containers as a service and pod as a service is here, and it's going to be part of the cloud. It's already in 2 clouds. And so I think fundamentally there's going to have to be orchestration for it, and I want that orchestration to be Kubernetes. And if we don't sort of sort this out, some other orchestration will develop, right? Because it's just a natural tendency. And I don't really want to see that, because I think.
Oh, but Vogel said there is no orchestration anymore.
Well, I'm not sure I read his blog.
Hey, Brian.
And then the other.
Hey, Brian. I'm representing AWS and AWS here, not Werner. So.
And the other thing that I would say is that I think that this investigation has actually exposed some architectural decisions that we made in terms of binding pods really tightly to nodes. And that's the awkwardness that we see here, and that's the thing that I think that is interesting to revisit ultimately, is to see if we really still believe that that is something that is fundamental, or if it was just a mistake that was made because of where we were at.
And maybe that's a good lead-in, Brennan, which is the idea that effectively we have kind of 2 perspectives. We have the one that containers are tied to the operating system, and another perspective, which is a container is a unit of software being run and the details are kind of hidden from it, which are 2 different abstractions. Are you arguing that the abstraction for the simpler one is valuable, even if it means it's not the same abstraction? Like, cause we can't ever make like a deep abstraction and a light abstraction be the same. We can just get them close. Is that the argument?
No, I don't think so. What I mean is that, because I think saying that a container is tied to an operating system, like a generic operating system, is fine. But it doesn't need to be it can be the concept of an operating system, not a literal machine with an operating system, if that makes sense. Right? Like me understanding that it's the Red Hat kernel version 4.6.x that's underneath my container, that seems relevant and important.
Well, I was going to say, like, Windows versus Linux, right? A Windows container doesn't look anything like a Linux container. We just all pretend like they're the same thing.
Yeah, and I don't want to. That's not what I'm arguing for. What I'm actually saying is something like is a little bit It's more architectural, which is to say that, for example, we say node name in the pod spec. Node name in the pod spec is what indicates that a pod has been scheduled. That's probably not right. It probably should be something like scheduled. Has the pod been scheduled or not? It should be a Boolean, not a string that implies a Boolean. And then another thing is like exec, right? So we assume that the API server assumes that in order to exec inside a container, it needs to go talk to a kubelet running on a node, right? And so it doesn't really have any concept of like being able to say, well, the URL for the exec API is here. It assumes like, oh, I can look up the node for the pod, and then I can go and call the exec API on the node IP address. right? It's just, there are places where we just bake things a little tightly.
Hey, Brendan, this is Derek. I think one of the questions I've had is, it sounded like from Ria's discussion that you were still tackling a hybrid model, like there would still be a real node, and then there's this nodeless pool. I think it's still, I don't know how much you've tracked like Tim O'Clair's sandboxing proposal, but it seems like the surface area of workloads that are supportable in the model presented is smaller or narrower than what Virtual Kubelet was initially presenting. Like, have you guys mapped like the Virtual Kubelet use case to like the sandbox proposal? And if a sandbox,
I think they're totally different, actually. You know,
it seems like if the
sandboxing.
sandbox was implemented remote to a node, like that was.
No, it's deeper than that, because the trouble with it is that there's all this stuff. Like, sandboxing is really just about isolation, right? Whereas this isn't really about isolation. This is about the fact that the surface that you're running on is no longer visible to you. Like the aspects of the surface that you're running on are no longer visible to you.
Brian has his hand up.
Yeah, so I actually went and looked at the Virtual Kubelet repo, and I saw Brendan's original demo way back when, and had some feedback, which doesn't look like it was actually implemented. But my high-level concern is the project is super ambitious. It's trying to implement Kubernetes on top of incompatible container services. And it's re-implementing Couplet, the container runtime, kubeproxy, pod networking, storage, the scheduler, and even some workload APIs are mentioned in the issues. That's a huge, massive effort. And it looks like you're like 1% down the path of implementing all that functionality. So I'm really concerned about fragmenting the ecosystem and the community, diverting effort into this project. It seems like the interface boundary is cut at the wrong place. Like, I agree with the concept of nodeless Kubernetes, like that as an offering makes sense, but I think it is being implemented in a way that doesn't reuse most of Kubernetes.
Yeah, I think that the question really is, there are three options for this implementation. You know, we don't go into this lightly. I think that, you know, the three options are what we did with Virtual Kubelet, where you have a fake node. There is what Joe has proposed as like the shrink wrap option, which is whenever there's a container to be run, you create a node around it, right? So instead of having one infinite node, you have an infinite number of perfectly sized nodes, one for each container in the container as a service. Or the third is we actually explicitly model nodeless inside of Kubernetes. And I don't see any other options. I think that this approach that we have is the most pragmatic. It's the one that gets us the most traction most quickly with the least amount of architectural changes, as evidenced by the fact that we can do it entirely on the outside.
Well, you can do it on the outside because you're not implementing most of Kubernetes. Like, the number of pod features that are not implemented seems very high from what I could tell.
Yeah, but so the thing is, Brian, as I said in the beginning, I think we have a choice, right? And the choice is, do we think that container as a service is an important thing to integrate into Kubernetes? And I would argue that the answer,
incompatible container as a service is important to integrate, you mean?
no, I mean, this is container. There's 2 of the 3 Couplet clouds have this right now, defined this way. It's not going to change, right? And so, you know, I think that this is, and it's going to look the same no matter what, right? Like, I'm not actually even sure what you mean by incompatible, because like I think the surface area is going to look like this no matter who implements it, right? So, this is how Hyper implemented it. This is how anybody who's implementing it is going to implement it, right? And so, I think it's important for us to explore this. I don't think we're wedded to any particular implementation. I just think that this is the one that was most pragmatic. And I think going into architectural purism at the expense of actually making forward progress is probably not a positive thing to do.
All right, so just to hang on here, we got a lot of people who want to speak, and Erica Von Bulow actually had a question first I don't want to get to, which is, if there are all these architectural discrepancies, why use pods as opposed to a new resource type? Do you want to speak to that real quick, and then we can go to other questions?
Right, that's option 3. So that's definitely a possibility.
Okay. I know Bob has his hand up. Ben, I believe, had his hand up. Let's start with, okay, we're going to go right to left. Let's start with, looks like, who's that in the room with you? Brian, I can't see that.
Sure. My name's Ken Owens. I'm a co-chair of SIG Apps. I know most of you guys.
Okay.
So one of my concerns is that I don't see how this is going to interact well with the current way that we handle storage. So like, I feel like it's really constrained in the types of workloads that are actually applicable when you run on virtual kubelet, like stateful workloads or high performance batch workloads, Spark, for instance. I don't see how that works in this model. And I don't understand how, if we bring this into Kubernetes, how we can leverage the existing controllers that are concerned with volume provisioning and volume binding, and make it interact well with virtual kubelet.
Can you clarify that? Because actually, I think that should all work.
So if I assume this virtual kubelet, so we're assuming that virtual kubelet by design is going to be compatible with whatever persistent volume provisioning works under the hood. So I can.
It has to be compatible. I mean, different implementations of container as a service will have different kinds of volumes that they can mount, just like different clouds have different kinds of volumes that they can mount, and different clusters have different kinds of volumes that they can mount. But at the high level, in terms of PVs and PVCs and stuff like that, yes.
Okay, I just don't understand necessarily how that would work if you've got a hyper virtual. Well,
I mean, so just as a concrete example, Azure Container Instances can mount Azure files right now. So if you create a pod with an Azure Files mount PV or PVC that is implemented by Azure Files, it'll get mounted into your Azure Container Instances pod that is running on serverless infrastructure.
So then you're enforcing that constraint on all implementations that if you implement virtual kubelet, you have to be compatible with the volume types that are also supported by the provisioner with your cloud provider?
I'm not sure I follow what you're saying.
It's true already that, I mean, Brendan is correct that it is true already that which volumes are supported depends on the environment in which Kubernetes runs.
Yeah. So you're just saying it would be a subset of those, potentially a subset of the volumes that you already have, should still work.
Just like it is in every cloud provider.
Yeah. Okay. So those volume implementations are not currently part of conformance. Okay, so should we move on to Bob?
Bob was next, yes, and then Ben.
Sure. I just I wanted to express a perspective and also why I think it's so important that we be doing this work inside Kubernetes. And I do agree that in the short run, this approach is going to have some constraints. We have a lot of customers who are very interested in using Kubernetes, but accessing the Fargate service, but doing that from the perspective of using Kubernetes. And even in the Fargate case, like the storage limits, there are limitations to the way the service works with regards to storage, but that doesn't mean that it isn't useful. So this is maybe the 20-80% thing that's being stated there. So I think this is a like, would you be able to pass total Kubernetes conformance out of the gate? I think the answer is no. Would you be able to add this kind of service in to a cluster to add a useful thing to the to users? I think the answer is absolutely yes, and you have to do it in a way that doesn't break applications and so forth. So, but I think like this doesn't feel to me like out of the gate that this is the long-term solution, but we really need a place where we can kind of work together collaboratively, in a place where we have a good place and a way to do this, and make some progress on this and work on like what the longer term architectural solution is to this in parallel to it. So, you know, I think one important thing here, certainly from the AWS perspective, Brian's comments about Werner's opinions notwithstanding, you know, there have been a lot of people who have suggested to me more directly that our involvement in Kubernetes is just some sort of stunt to try to like hold us over to where something like Fargate is worthwhile. People have suggested to me that, oh, we're just going to hollow out Kubernetes and try to replace it with Fargate. And it's really important for us, for everyone to understand that what we're trying to do is bridge the two here together in an upstream community-based way, and we need a great place to work on that so people kind of understand what we're doing. Thanks.
Did you consider offering an actual Kubernetes service that doesn't have nodes in addition to Fargate?
I think what we have to do is make some progress on that. I haven't been considering that. With EKS, our intentions we've been pretty open about our intentions, which is to run an upstream service. I think we need to see how the upstream community adopts this before we just make a decision about whether we're going to add that as a separate product.
Yeah, so I'm really concerned about introducing a new project that has such different characteristics from the rest of Kubernetes. And as I said, like it effectively re-implements more than half of Kubernetes.
It doesn't. How can you say re-implement?
That's not true, right?
So I actually went and looked at the surface area that it covers, and it's all the node level functionality, some of the control plane functionality.
That's because everything is tightly bound to the node, right? Like, and I think that this is again the point, which is we made decisions that there are things that are bound too tightly to the node of Kubernetes, and so we could rip it apart if we wanted to.
We are adding a new abstraction to Kube that didn't exist at the beginning, which is that there's some types of pods that aren't everything that's added to a pod. So we hit this with container runtimes already. Like every time someone adds a container runtime, originally it was really easy. It was, does Docker support it or not? And now we're in the, well, have you talked to all the container runtime implementations to make sure they support it? And that's been mostly an easy problem because everybody's kind of based on Run C, and most of the things people have wanted to add have been abstractions that work at the Run C level, not at the container runtime. It's like passing it through. I wanted to draw the analogy to like VM workloads on Kube as well. So like the KubeVirt team, and I know a few others who've said like, hey, we want to build new APIs on top of Kube. They have to re-implement stateful sets, but they don't have to re-implement services or auto-scaling or 3 or 4 others. When you think about like adding this new so like there's a hypothetical abstraction that either a pod doesn't completely work or there's a new type of pod. Like when you think about that abstraction, the moment that exists, if it's under a pod, everybody has to go talk to the various people who have those Couplet implementations or whatever. If it's above the pod, then you have to do extra work to make the same use cases. Somebody's going to pay the cost either way. It sounds like we're talking about whether this is an under or an over discussion.
Well, I think I would also say, just to Ryan's point, there are places that we have to re-implement. It's true, right? Like mounting files doesn't. The Couplet can't mount files. If we had a file mounting daemon that was abstracted in a different way, then maybe we could. But on the other hand, as Clayton points out, we don't have to re-implement services, right? Like, because we are integrated with existing Kubernetes objects, many things just work. Replica sets just work. Just get services, just work, right?
How does the kube proxy work?
Kube proxy doesn't need to work, right? It needs to be a separate, so there's a difference between kube proxy versus how a service is implemented.
Most of the network plugins implement their own kube proxy, especially if they're following that same cycle.
If when you create a service, it's an internal load balancer service instead of, so like an IP table service doesn't work, but an internal load balancing service does work.
Okay.
Right, and so that's the point, is that the kube proxy implementation itself is not a core part of Kubernetes. Kube proxy is just an implementation of services. You could rip it out. It was built to be ripped out.
I agree that kube proxy is portable. Matt has his hand up.
Actually, Ben has been waiting for quite some time to speak.
Hey guys. So I just wanted to provide a VMware perspective on this because we've been looking at this for quite a while. Might be helpful. We've been doing containers as a service for about 3 years now in vSphere, where we create containers as VMs. And to the sandboxing discussions that have been happening in SIG Node, that's a lot of what we've been looking at. The idea of sandboxing pods as VMs, having run C inside there, extending a control plane into there, very similar to the Kata model. And I think that when we're talking about virtual kubelet and nodeless, to me, I'm hearing two different architectural models. I'm hearing the model where we have Kubernetes clusters managed by a service provider, and there needs to be some kind of consumption model fronting that, right? Some kind of nodeless consumption model where you can have, high multi-tenancy, abstract amounts of resource the tenants can consume, but that's not an architecture, that's a consumption model, right? That sits above nodes, and you still need nodes, you still need kubelet, and everything just works exactly the same way as it normally works. The second architecture, the one we're interested in, is one where you don't have a node, right? Where VMs are pods, and where the node is this abstract amount of resource in vSphere. When we're looking at that kind of a model, Kubelet just doesn't work for that because it makes so many assumptions about the node. So in that respect, what we're looking at does overlap quite a bit with the sandboxing model. But I think that there are potentially two use cases here that virtual kubelet's serving. What I would say is I'm not sure that presenting this abstract resource as a literal node is the right long-term solution. I think that's why it would be really worth having some good discussions about how that shows up in a cluster and how that's represented. Because I think there are some issues, for example, if a virtual node represents multiple failure domains, what does that mean for daemon sets, right? What does that mean for affinity? How does that work? So there are some important architectural questions that I think still need to be resolved there, but that's why I think this is a longer discussion we need to keep having.
Matt?
Yeah, so when I'm looking at this from kind of the outside looking in, the workload operation, right? Kubernetes provides us a way to declaratively say, here's the workloads that I want to happen, and then Kubernetes will try to make that happen, right? But it was built in a world that was based on what we had as the cloud at the time, which was very hardware-based with Metal as a Service, and more so with VM-based. And so we built around this idea because we didn't have container services to go off and give us these serverless environments where we could run workloads and run containers as. And so we built up our architecture of how we do that workload orchestration and management around what we had. But what I'm starting to hear is now we've got something new that is containers as a service, right? It's container services, so we don't have to worry about managing that's been pushed further down the stack to somebody else. And so now the discussion is, well, how can we make Kubernetes and its orchestration and declarative management of workloads work with these things so we don't have to care about them anymore because there's now services that offer this. And it's a problem because we just didn't have this before, and so we designed our architecture differently. And what I hear with the virtual kubelet is, it's a way of working where we don't have an extension point in Kubernetes to work, so it's trying to solve by working around the problem today. But there's a desire to say, how do we natively make this work with Kubernetes so these kinds of services have that API? You don't have to work around it because Kubernetes can natively work around those points. And so how do we make that work and happen? And so I understand that there's problems with the current path forward, but that's because we don't have an extension point. But one of the things we keep talking about in SIG architecture is adding these extension points so the ecosystem and the community can add to Kubernetes. So the API works and everything works, but we create these extension points for cloud providers, storage providers, everything else. And this seems like a place where figuring out how we add that extension point so we can still work with VMs out of the box and hardware out of the box, but coming up with a way to work with these other kinds of serverless environments that maybe is an API extension point for people might be a good way to go. In fact, this seems like the kind of thing that is right fit for an interesting working group because it has cross SIG responsibilities. And maybe it would make the idea of the virtual kubelet in its current form have to go away because now we've got the extension points to do it. And in the meantime, they can work on a solution to solving by working around our lack of extensibility.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's the right direction. My concern is that, so this represents a pretty massive effort to get this implemented in the right way. And meanwhile, we have some really serious project threats like the technical debt that's baked in and the fact that still a lot of things are tightly coupled in the monorepo and those things. It's like, where do we want to spend our effort and our time? Are we going to?
I don't think that's the right question, right? Because we have a lot of people who are interested in this.
No, I get that. I mean, but it's like,
resources aren't fungible in that way, and we invest elsewhere, right? Like, I mean, my teams invest in things other than this too, right? So I think, you know, everybody pays their due diligence in terms of the community, but I don't think we should make the decision based on like, oh, there's other work to be done somewhere else.
no, it's more just that there's, I mean, we have a limited number of high-level reviewers. We have a limited number of time, you know, that can be invested in this. I just want to be cognizant of when we choose to do something, if we're actually choosing to not do something as a result of that, and just have a discussion around it.
Can I
That's
make
just, I mean, so far, your virtual kubelet has had very little load on other reviewers. In fact, I think this is the first place where someone who's not in the project has had to weigh in.
Can I make a suggestion that before, I'm sure there are many obstacles to building virtual kubelet and supporting it and distracting resources from other things onto it, but I still don't have an understanding of what we're actually trying to solve here. So I understand from Brendan that we want to expose non-Kubernetes container as a services to look like Kubernetes. That seems to be one clear requirement. But beyond that, all of the other things I've heard seem to actually be orthogonal to virtual kubelet. For example, I don't want to have to manage my nodes. Well, you don't have to manage them. There are plenty of services that'll manage your nodes for you. I don't want to see the abstraction of the node. I don't want to see which node my container is on. Well, you know, we could remove that. We'll just don't look at it if we don't want to know about it. I still don't understand what we're actually trying to solve here.
Quentin, I might be able to jump in and add some of that. So, right, it comes down to like billing and what you have to manage. Right now, you're right, you get to punt on the VMs, right, with some of the services, but you still have to pay for those, right? So it comes down to almost a billing model, and then it gets into serverless.
Sorry, you don't have to pay for those. Like, we could charge, GKE could charge per pod instead of, at least per pod instead of per virtual machine. Billing is a completely separate issue from architecture.
So I think the, you know, I don't want to pay for it is a, you guys hear me? There's a lot of noise from somebody.
Yes.
Sorry. I think the issue of do I want to pay for it or not is a product issue, not a project issue. And that, I think that's cool. If people want to make a product that is pay for what you use, like, go do so. I'm not sure that it needs technical infrastructure for that.
But I think it's different than that though, actually, because just the fundamental characteristics are different. I can spin up a container in, you know, milliseconds to seconds. No one can spin up a VM that fast, right? And so I can actually charge you pay for what you use costs with container as a service, and I really can't with VMs because it's reserved capacity.
If it was important,
that's not true, Brendan. I mean, that's exactly what multi-tenant Kubernetes gives you. Is you take a bunch of customers and you provision enough nodes for all of them, and you spin up containers and you manage the Slack. I mean, that's what all.
Yeah, but from a customer perspective, like, this is, and maybe this is a path towards multi-tenant Kubernetes ultimately, but like, Kubernetes is not multi-tenant safe right now, right? And so, like, I want to be working on this now. And as Matt said, I think maybe the ultimate path of this is we decide, you know what, multi-tenant Kubernetes is the right way to solve these problems. And you're right. I think that the point is really that we need a working group to explore this, because this technology already exists and is going to continue to be built. And I don't want to reinvent another orchestration layer.
We have a working group. It's the multi-tenancy working group.
So
sorry, there's like,
well, that's multi-tenancy is different, right? Multi-tenancy is hardening. It's not talking about nodeless infrastructure.
But there are similarities from the user's perspective that we should discuss, though. But let's get to other people.
Yeah, Matt, and then I think somebody else I saw had their hand up.
I think Tim has had his hand up as well.
Okay.
And Erica had hers up too. I'm not sure who was first.
All right, let's start with Erica. We'll go to Matt, and then.
Oh, I was going to say, I don't think I was first to raising my hand at all, but is like, I was going to say is like cross-cloud workloads closer than multi-tenancy to what we're going for?
Cross-platform?
Yes, it is much closer, because what we're really trying to do is build a mechanism for bridging some of these systems together. For example, I mean, you could even think about how to use this to bridge from, say, Kubernetes to Mesos, just to like pick a random one, right? Where you have a different system that's building that's actually going and executing the containers underneath. And while I've got the mic, I also mentioned that we do actually have a second kind of related project in Kubernetes presently, which is KubeMark. And one of the things, I know I talked to Tim a little bit about this at KubeCon, one of the things that I would want to see come out of this is a shim built into the virtual kubelet that would let us deprecate KubeMark and have a more fully baked node implementation with a test driver underneath, so that we can support scalability tests without actually, against the control plane without actually running containers underneath. And this would be a pretty good approach for that. Okay, I'm done.
Matt.
I'm kind of feeling that maybe there's a question at the core of what Kubernetes is here, right? Is it containers as a service, or is it orchestration on top of containers as a service, or is it both? I'm not sure we all assume the same thing, just given some of the comments I've heard in the conversation. But that does speak to what the heart of it is. If it's orchestration on top of containers as a service, then this API layer to talk to containers as a service makes sense, in including to providing our own where the environment isn't there. If it's containers as a service itself, then that's why it would be seen as competing against that, some of these other services. So there's kind of that philosophical question of who we are here.
All right, Tim?
So just from a logistical perspective, there's clearly enough inertia. It's just a matter of what SIG would sponsor the working group and what it would live underneath. Now, I think right now it's very early goings, and there might be some contention on how we disentangle some pieces of the API and try to create new primitives, and that's okay. And if folks want to create a working group, I don't see any problem with that. That's up to them and their resources and how they utilize them, right? The question, I think from a logistical perspective, that's totally fine, and they could feed back into a primary SIG. I think we are bike shedding a lot on some details, which I think it's too early for us to even ascertain all of the changes that could be made. So I'm just wondering, what is our intent of some of this conversation? Because it seems like folks want to create a working group, and from the steering committee perspective, there's nothing preventing folks from creating a working group so long as it's sponsored by a set of SIGs.
So or if it's outside the project, just to be clear.
Or if it's outside the project.
Discuss whatever they want.
So I was gonna say, like, to summarize Jason's point earlier, like what the ask is, and Brendan, tell me if you think this is incorrect. The ask is to put aside time at a high level architectural view to consider large fundamental abstraction changes to something that's fairly important to the project, as well as an understanding that some of the abstractions that we have that work because we don't bother, like we don't support two different types of nodes, we just support nodes or a single kubelet, that we spend additional time allowing or in designs considering the possibility that that abstraction has to change. Your examples around exec and logs and all that. Those are costs to everyone. Everyone has to enforce and deal with those. And the potential payoff is that it provides value to these users on these platforms, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because of people on those platforms. That cost, I think the flip side of it, and this is to what Tim was saying, is the pushback or the question would be, does everybody have to sign up for that cost if we create a working group because the working group has it? So I'm trying to be deliberate up front, like changing fundamental abstractions causes a cost to everything else. Therefore, is the end value for all users of Kubernetes sufficient to justify paying that cost?
I think that's a totally reasonable supposition, and summarizing of what we're asking. I would say that I guess the degree to which we move forward quickly or slowly will probably depend on how valuable we think the costs are, right? Like we're on a path right now where we can move forward. And if at some point we say, you know what, we have to fundamentally re-architect the way logs and exec work, well, that's going to be, go through the feature proposal like any other feature proposal, and people will prioritize it depending on how valuable they think it is, and it will either go fast or slow, and that's just kind of how the project works. So I feel like the project can figure out for itself how much or little effort they want to put into it. So I don't think it will cause a lot of extra pain. And I guess what I'm really looking for more than anything else is that we say this is the working group for these kinds of issues. And if anybody is interested in these kinds of issues, that's the work. Once we design a working group, I don't want to be in a situation where we have 2 or 3, parallel initiatives doing similar-ish things, right? And so that would be the other part. Ria, you have your hand up.
Mm-hmm. So for a lot of the features and implementation, we're actually doing that already. The reason that we want your guys' opinions is because we basically want a home for this project and we want to be part of Kubernetes. The project as a whole is moving forward right now. So that's already a given and it's already happening. We're already implementing it, where customers are using it, things like that. So the project, the feature specs, everything else, that's happening. So we just want a place to bring those up and talk about it in a forum where we all can meet and talk about it, basically.
I think that makes a ton of sense, and we definitely need to have a really constructive discussion around this, because I think the really dangerous scenario we could wind up is a ton of work goes into something. There's a lot of popular movement around some corollary project like this, and then there's just customer churn because they don't know how to get it supported or where to implement it and whatnot. So definitely discussing this makes a lot of sense. I really want to understand what we're not doing as a result, or how we don't implement this in a way that actually distracts or causes us to lose faith or have trust undermined in our customers because we're not focusing on actual things that they need. So if that winds up being the case, that this is a high customer need and we need to adopt it and do these things, and then that makes sense. I mean, we'll figure it out, but we just need to be really cognizant of that.
So, presumably you already have mailing lists and you're having discussions and you have a home for the project, right? So I'm not sure why that needs to change or what value you would get out of that. But aside from that, I'm a big fan of the idea here, but not the design. I would love to see us talk about it. What I'm worried about is if we seed a conversation with a half-done implementation, that it becomes sort of impossible to really consider alternative models.
So I'd love to have that discussion, and I thought in some ways we were going to have that discussion here. I think I stated the 3 designs. The 3 designs that I see possible. 1 is the current one that we have. 2 is the shrink-wrapped containers, and 3 is that it's a totally new API object. And they all have trade-offs, and they're all imperfect, right? If it's a totally new API object, then things like services don't work, and we have to do a lot of work to re-implement services. If we shrink-wrap, then the scheduler doesn't work, and we have to do a bunch of work to insert an alternate scheduler.
I don't know what shrink-wrap means.
Oh, shrink-wrap means basically somebody submits a pod, and dynamically you create a node that is exactly the right size, and you bind that. Like, you create a fake node again, but instead of having a fake node that contains lots of containers, you have a fake node that contains exactly 1 container.
That's the dynamic volume provisioning model, basically.
That already tastes better to me.
Yeah, but the trouble with that is you have to implement a new scheduler. And you don't. So you have all of the problems of virtual kubelet. Like, you have all of the problems of virtual kubelet, and you have to implement a new scheduler.
I hate to say this on SIG architecture, but it's that's a big enough topic that we shouldn't talk about it here. We should talk about the possibility that we can talk about it in a forum. I was going to say, the one point that I really wanted to make is on a lot of the small stuff, I feel like the benefit in terms of multi-tenancy and alignment is if when there's abstractions that exist in Kubernetes that are beneficial for others to change as well, because there's feature alignment, like multi-tenancy sandbox. For exec and logging, like we've always wanted to make it so that you could bypass the master going in exec and logging. Like there's a lot of good examples of things where if we can tie that into other things we want, that's an easy way to get a lot of the small stuff lined up. And that's more of like SIG negotiating, like going to a SIG and being like, hey, this feature could overlap. Do we want to work together? We both get something out of it. Like I feel like that sort of horse trading is appropriate when it's more mechanical work and abstractions that just exist because they exist, like exec.
So, somebody brought up that this is the kind of thing that maybe, Clayton, you said, not necessarily here. We should have this conversation, but I think there's two big reasons to bring this into the community. One is it allows people from many different companies to be involved and not just one company to have it as their project. And that's one of the big reasons for, bringing things into the community. And then it lets us look at better ways to design this and maybe to alter Kubernetes to make it easier so it's less complicated and easier to do. Because if you're doing it on the outside, you're stuck with the constraints of the community. It's harder to move it. But if we intentionally work together inside the community to make this easier, it becomes easier to have a simple design. And of course, with all of this benefit, you get more neat ideas like the discussion around scheduler and writing a scheduler to solve this. And maybe somebody can go play with it. By bringing it into the community, we get to have these conversations and get to experiment with these ideas and have more eyeballs on it. And that's what I really like about bringing it here.
Well, I actually share a concern that I think Jace.
Wait, I think Nishi had her hand up. Can we go to her?
Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry.
Thanks, Erica. I was just trying to understand if we are agreeing that a working group is required, and can we have virtual kubelet as one of the options, but actually discuss other ways of solving the nodeless problem and not have the discussion here, because I don't think it's going to be productive.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I don't think anyone's proposing a virtual kubelet working group. I think we are proposing a nodeless working group.
And Brian and Tim, I think your ideas are valid, and maybe you should guide us into solving the problem, and then we can have a debate with Brendan in the room rather than solve all the problems here.
Well, so what I was going to say is the point that I think Jace brought up earlier, which is it will cost some amount of time, and time is zero sum, right? So
no, but I mean, I think we want to be clear. I want to be clear, and I think this is true of all working groups, right? Which is to say, if people say, "Hey, I'm too busy, we can't make that decision," we'll wait till the next week. Right? Like every project moves forward at the speed of which it's a priority. I think what we're mostly asking for is that this be a working group so that everybody in the Kubernetes community who's interested in this idea can have a place where they can work together. We're not asking for accelerated decision making or special treatment or to be the #1 priority. We just want to have this be recognized as an official effort of the Kubernetes for all of the good reasons that were mentioned earlier.
So has anyone gone to the, anyone involved with the nodeless efforts participated in the multi-tenancy or sandboxing conversations as yet to understand?
I don't think either of those, I don't think anyone's gone to those working groups. I don't think that either of those, I've read a lot of their docs. And actually, so Jess Frizzell has participated in the multi-tenancy. She's not directly in the virtual kubelet project, but she's part of my team. I think I understand both those projects reasonably well, and I don't actually think that there's a heavy amount of overlap, although to Clayton's point, I think it would be great to find the places where there are small pieces that overlap and work on them together.
I actually think there's a substantial amount of overlap. So the multi-tenancy working group, for example, is trying to define some security profiles. So if you think about the perspective of an unprivileged user in a multi-tenant cluster, one of the things they're not going to have access to is shared resources like nodes. So if you look at OpenShift, for example, unprivileged users cannot access nodes, and they cannot apply things like node selectors necessarily, because they can't even know what the labels on those nodes are, right? So I think there has been work, and there is work that is related, that's ongoing, that we need to seriously look at how it can inform the nodeless model.
I totally agree with that. I think that to the point that we have API changes, but so far we haven't requested nor required any API changes.
So is there even a list of what functionality is expected to never work? I couldn't find one on the virtual kubelet site. I went and did a catalog of things that don't appear to work, and it's like dozens and dozens of pod features.
Sure, Brian, this concern has been registered, and I don't think that it's relevant to this discussion. So, I mean, I'm happy
I think it's relevant is because people's applications will not work if random features don't work.
Sorry.
Right, but we've already exactly. But we've already said, I mean, the virtual kubelet from the get-go, it's an explicit gesture, right? It's intended to be. You don't accidentally land on the virtual kubelet, and that's not the design for the foreseeable future until all of people's apps do work, right? You have to explicitly say, hey, my app is compatible with this, and I understand the restrictions.
This is where there is some overlap with the sandboxing question, right? Because already in the sandboxing discussion, people are saying, okay, well, privileged, what does that mean, right, in a sandbox? What does it mean to have access to the control plane in the sandbox, right? Some of these questions are already being asked, and I think that's where some of that overlap is there.
And that's great, and we should definitely have those conversations together.
I think Nishi had something to say. And we have 4 minutes, by the way. So.
I just wanted to convey that we have done a detailed design discussion, and I'm happy to write a full document to show you what works, what doesn't work, just so you can look at it. And then if that allows us to positively move forward and discuss what is the right design, we would be happy to put the work into it. But I think the ask is, can you guys be involved with us so we can actually move in the right direction? And maybe dynamic node provision, which Tim was mentioning, could be the right design.
Nishi, I think the issue here is that when we're asking the steering committee folks for this level of involvement with this, we're back to Brian's concern about zero-sum game. I think what we're really asking for here is some space for us to go and work on this, and maybe we do have to find the right SIG to support it. Whether I'm hearing some suggestion from Brian that SIG multi-tenancy might be the right way. I would actually propose that the new SIG provider might be the better spot, since a lot of the interest here seems to be getting driven from the provider side. But my feeling is that we need to go and work on this more before we are starting to ask for SIG architecture time directly.
Yeah, I think basically what I'm interested in is two things. One is an acknowledgement that this is a problem that is worth solving, and that serverless container architectures should be integrated with Kubernetes at some point, somehow. And then the other is a backstop for the working group, which is to say, everybody has lots of things that they're doing. We've engaged with SIG node, for example, but it's not clear that they're interested. If we fail to find a SIG to sponsor, I would hope that SIG architecture can backstop that. Although I suspect that SIG provider is probably a good home too, as Bob said. But that's really what I'm looking for.
Hey, Brennan, I think from SIG node perspective, though, I think we have engaged and said we wanted to understand why it could not work underneath the CRI. And I think that's why the sandboxing discussion is heavily pertinent, because the sandbox scopes the surface area of the pod spec to something much more palatable for
I mean, and I feel like we've had that discussion. I mean, I'm happy to have a discussion again about why CRI doesn't work. It's just the wrong architectural layer. If you look at the API binding, it just doesn't
But that discussion predated the discussion of sandboxing, and I don't think we've had that discussion since discussing sandboxing.
Are you changing the CRI API?
I mean, Tim Auclair's proposal does propose changes to the CRI API, but it also.
But I mean, are you fundamentally changing? I have to admit, I haven't looked at the details of his proposal, but the fundamental disconnect has to do with things like the CRI API says things like prepare container. like that, and that's just not something that works in one of these.
Sure. So the CRI is still alpha and not fixed, right? So if there were changes that were needed to be driven to drive a use case, that's worth discussing. I think the tension had been if virtualizing a node was the right model versus a node presenting virtual resources, or a pod exposing a subset of the API that a runtime could support by saying, you know, I only support, you know, that which is defined as a sandbox pod. But I think when you all first engaged SIG Node months ago, we had not yet had the sandboxing discussion, and we haven't revisited this discussion in light of the recent sandboxing work.
Sure, and I'm happy to do that, but I think it's going to be really messy, honestly, because you're going to end up with something that looks a lot like the virtual kubelet anyway, if you go down this road, because if I want to have a cluster that has no nodes in it that can access serverless container infrastructure, like I'm going to have a node. Anyway, I'm happy to talk more.
The issue is just the virtual kubelet said it could support potentially all the knobs of a pod, whereas the sandbox reduces the set of knobs on a pod to eliminate access to host resources.
Yeah, but I mean, the trouble with it is, like, mounting a file system, for example, happens outside of the CRI, right? And so, like, well, we're clearly going to want to mount file systems, so how do we make that work? Like, there's a lot of challenges. I've looked at it. I mean, honestly, like, I looked at CRI and I was like, I think this is the right way to do it, and then I started to actually try to implement it, and it just didn't work.
So hey, folks, time, guys. We're over time. Can we set aside some time in office hours next week to have more discussion on this? Are you able to attend, Ria?
Can I actually just ask for closure? Can I say that, I mean, are we okay with it? We just want a working group, and I think there was consensus that that's a good idea.
Is there anybody opposed to the working group?
For defining what the nodeless model should be, not for virtual kubelet implementation details.
Correct. A working group for nodeless.
Yeah, and I'd like us to be very clear about what the output of that working group should be. Working groups are kind of short-term things that have concrete deliverables, so we should figure out exactly what that is.
Yeah, Brendan, could you, like, I feel like, can someone take the responsibility to draft a working group proposal and then open that at the architecture group, and then we can nitpick the initial paragraphs?
Yeah, I can open that up.
That sounds great. And I think that, I mean, just at a high level, I think that the output is a design that we all agree on, and the other options considered and why not, right? That's the output that I would want out of that working group.
The design, or how the model appears to users? Like, I really want to frame it around, can the user access nodes? What happens to the node name field in the pods? Do daemon sets work? Behavioral characteristics? Not the...
Sure, we can, I mean, sure, I can have the output. We can have the output be both the... I think one implies the other, but we can definitely skew it around, like, user experience instead of architectural design, or both, really.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been a very good and spirited discussion, and we will continue this, and we'll review the working group charter as that comes up. And thank you all, everybody, so much.
Thanks all.
Thank you.